Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at capitalism. I think it's a term that most people know and relate it to the economic system that we predominantly know in the West. It's an economic system that has become dominant because of the colonial process. But it began somewhere in the 15th century. The argument is that Portugal introduced, is the first main instance of capitalism, I should say, on an island off the coast of North Africa, an island called Madeira, where there was a sugar plantation in which they exploited sugar and the use of slaves to produce the sugar from the sugar cane. And Madeira being an island full of, they had a large forest basically. I think it was mainly dominated by forest. It's one of the reasons they chose the island. But they exhausted basically the timber of the island in the process of producing the sugar. When that timber was exhausted, they basically just moved on to another island to start producing more sugar. So this idea of using a capital and exhausting it till it has expired, which is a typical capitalist mindset of using resources until they're finished and then moving on somewhere else and then finding another resource to use in the same way. This boom and bust idea of capitalism basically, and this is seen as the first instance of that back in the 15th century. So anyway, so that's an idea of what I'll be talking about, but I'll be looking at the background and the thinking behind capitalism and the Western world's idea of what an economic system should be. So the thinking behind this capitalism came from one of the European philosophers, John Locke, in his concept. I'll explain an excerpt from one of his documents here. Yet every man has a property in his own person, the labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say are properly his. But whosoever then removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath thereby mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. Basically what he's saying is that by working on a piece of land, wherever you go colonize somewhere and you start working on that piece of land, that now makes that piece of land your property because you have joined your labor with that land. So this is the idea and concept behind this thing called capitalism. One of the main ideas that capitalists use to justify basically the idea for appropriating land from other people is that they go on the land, they bring slaves to work on the land, and because they have now invested in the land basically, that land is now theirs, even though the land actually belongs to somebody else. And because they've now appropriated that land, they'll go ahead now to fight to keep that land. Or they'll kick the people off the land to take over the land and claim that it's theirs because they're now making use of the land somehow. So anyway, in a state of nature then individuals come to have property rights in the resources they mix their labor with. The standard case that is brought to mind is coming to own a field through tilling an area of soil. So that idea of using a piece of land somehow gives them the right to take that land and claim that it is theirs. So that is the concept behind capitalism and the appropriation of people's resources to use for yourself, because you think that you can grab the resource and start using it, then you become the owner of that resource in the capitalist Western mindset. So what capitalism is a socio-economic system that emerged in the Western Europe in the 16th century, emphasizing individual efforts to drive economic growth. This system is distinguished by its reliance on market economies, where human labor, production means, and natural resources are allocated according to market demands. Central to, well, you say market demands, but you can create a demand for a product. You develop a product or you find a resource and you create a demand for it by somehow marketing and advertising it, and therefore you have created a market for something that you discovered. Central to capitalism is the transformation of natural resources into commodities, which often involves detaching these resources from their natural settings. Basically, you dig up and mine the resources, and then you refine it into something else and sell it or market it somewhere else in the world. Private property rights are also a hallmark of capitalism, granting owners significant control over how their resources are used, often prioritizing profit over the societal or environmental aspects. Societal aspects I'll be dealing with later on in terms of how capitalism has actually changed. So some of these documents, what I'll be reading now comes from a document from a research website called Capitalism and Resource. That was the first part, but then I'll also be looking at, what I'm looking at now is what the IMF understanding of capitalism is. And the pillars of capitalism, according to the IMF, are private property, which allows people to own tangible assets such as land, houses, intangible assets such as stocks and bonds, then self-interest, through which people act in pursuit of their own good, without regard for socio-political pressure. Nonetheless, these uncoordinated individuals end up benefiting society, as if, in the words of Smith in 1776 Wealth of Nations, they were guided by an invisible hand. The invisible hand of what now? Greed. But that is the main reason Europeans see, well, they see maybe they can provide a service or commodity, but greed sets in and they want to profit from providing that service. So the main reason for providing that service now or that product is to make more money or more profit. And she wants to sell get the resource as cheap as possible by exploiting people and getting resources basically free and making a profit by selling at whatever price you want. Continuing with the IMF interpretation, competition through firms' freedom to enter and exit markets maximizes social welfare, that is the joint welfare of both producers and consumers. As I said, I'll be talking about that later on. A market mechanism that determines prices in a decentralized manner through interactions between buyers and sellers, and this allocation of resources, which naturally seek the highest reward. And then finally, freedom to choose with respect to consumption, production, and investment. Dissatisfied customers can buy different products. But even if a dissatisfied customer buys a different product, that product usually fits into a framework of what the producers have to offer. So it's not a free idea, free choosing of whatever you want. Basically, you only choose from what is on offer. Investors can pursue more lucrative ventures. Workers can leave their jobs for better pay. Not nowadays, though. And the last aspect is a limited role of government to protect the rights of private citizens and maintain an orderly environment that facilitates proper functioning of markets. But as they say in crony capitalism, it's the government that supports the big business or the capitalist by providing an environment for them to make more profit. So it's not necessarily about limiting government, it's making use of government to provide the political structure for the wealthy to continue making their wealth. So there are three stages of capitalism: mercantilism, market capitalism, and corporate welfare, which I'll be detailing all three in a minute. And the first one, mercantilism, is the first stage of capitalism, representing a symbiotic relationship between government and business. Business provided governments with a source of tax revenue. Governments provided business opportunities for profit. Governments offered business protection, established monopolies, and the right policies so that it can benefit and make more profit. And we continue with this. Mercantilism is more known in terms of around the 17th to 18th century, when countries used to use tariffs quite a lot. and put restrictions on other countries from selling their products in your country. So basically you export goods, but you don't allow goods to be exported to your country. You don't allow competition, basically, similar to what Trump is doing in terms of restricting China and other countries in terms of exporting goods to the US, whilst the US can export goods to other countries. Well, that's not exactly what Trump is doing, but mercantilism is based on the idea that you restrict other countries from selling the products that you're producing in your country to your own people. So you want your country to build its economy, build its production base. Also, you want to be able to export, but you want to restrict the capacity of other countries to do the same. So in the early days of capitalism, this mercantilism was a process of creating national market required reducing transport costs, clearing waterways and digging canals reduce the costs of the two most important resources in transporting goods, wind and water. Industries spread along the rivers into the forests. In many places, the spread of industry led to widespread deforestation, and European countries established colonies to provide resources and provide markets, actually, especially gold and silver, in order to fuel the expansion. So through this process, they seized land and used free labor of indigenous people across the world. The second stage of capitalism is market capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, or market capitalism as they call it. And this was ushered in by the innovations introduced in the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the last decades of the 18th century. And this Industrial Revolution had a number of profound implications for society. First, machines, like the steam engine, freed industry from its dependence on water and wind. And it also allowed companies to set up wherever they wanted to set up, rather than be stuck in particular locations where there's a source of water, and so forth. Second, the introduction of railroads reduced the price of coal related to wood. So they started using coal more than wood. And the use of coal freed society from its dependence on renewable sources, enabling individuals to tap into energy accumulated over eons. This coal, which coal came about as a result of timber mainly, not even decomposing. Timber covered in earth and left to supposedly rot in a confined area turns into coal. I think the restriction of air from the decomposition of timber causes it to turn to coal. The third aspect of the Industrial Revolution, the factory system depersonalizing relations between capitalists and workers. So this is where the capitalists began to exploit workers more, where you create a factory system where you pay cheap labor to produce a product. So the government aspect is this laissez-faire means that the government didn't really interfere in the business activities of companies unless they introduce policies that would benefit a company. And the last stage, I should say, of capitalism is the corporate welfare state. And this is associated with the development of new technologies. First is railroad, steel production, and oil. This enabled business to reduce their unit cost by expanding output. And corporations gained prominence as a means of reducing competition by controlling output. Second, many of the new technologies proved expensive. So they raised their resources, or the financial resources, through basically processes like using stocks and bonds, or selling stocks of the companies to raise funds to operate their businesses. So those are the three stages of capitalism. And continuing with some of the new technologies, talking about oil and Standard Oil as a company, used to, at one time, monopolize the oil industry in the US until it was split up into two companies, Chevron and another oil company, another of the major oil companies in the US, under the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Anyway, that's a look at the stages of the development of capitalism. But they give you the impression that there's only one particular economic system in the world that has, you might say, benefited the world. Although, yes, capitalism has allowed countries to make some forms of profit, but at the same time, there's a lot of exploitation taking place. Even in developed countries, you find that you have the rich and then you have the poor. In fact, it's becoming increasingly worse in Western countries, where you have people, increasingly you see people sleeping on the streets. Yeah, these are supposed to be the most wealthy countries in the world, and yet the top 1% or so are even making more wealth than ever before. Anyway, I'll be touching on that later on. Political capitalism, this is the political aspect, as I mentioned, and how politics can benefit the capitalists. So it's an economics and political system in which the economic and political elite cooperate for their mutual benefit. So basically the rich and those in high political position, well, those in high political positions, particularly in the West, they benefit from the capitalist system by making money for themselves, and the capitalists themselves continue to benefit from the use of government. And you could say bribes are paid behind the scenes to encourage certain politicians to support policies that would benefit a corporation. And this is usually how you find that money controls government, particularly in the West. The economic elite influence of the government economics policies to use regulation, government spending, and design of the tax system to maintain the elite status in the economy. The political elite are then supported by the economic elite, which helps the political elite maintain their status and exchange relationship that benefits both the political and economic elite. So this system was explicitly implemented in the fascist and corporatist economies of Germany and Italy between the world wars. And as he was leaving office as President Eisenhower warned of the dangers of the military-industrial complex, which still exists today, the so-called connections between the military and the political, in terms of the political encouraging wars to take place, so that the military-industrial complex can continue to manufacture arms and sell arms and make its money from government. At the political level, capitalism was also responsible for most of the features which today are referred to as Western democracy. So abolishing feudalism, the capitalists insisted on parliaments, constitutions, freedom of the press, and so forth. All of these things sound benevolent, but in reality they are there for the economic benefit of the capitalists. Parliaments, I'm not sure whether it's capitalists who insisted on that, or they could have insisted. I know in particular in certain Western countries they encouraged parliaments instead of a system where kings ruled. Now the people with money would rule through controlling the members of government or members of parliament. Also, they influence constitutions. Our constitutions were also developed in order to provide an advantage to those who like money. However, the peasants and workers of Europe and eventually the inhabitants of the whole world paid a huge price so that capitalists could make their profits from the human labor that always lies behind their machines. But what's going to happen in the future when everything is automated? What is going to happen to human labor? So, continuing, this is talking about imperialism. Up to the end of the 1950s, Russia, China, Korea, and certain nations in Eastern Europe were the only countries which had decisively broken with capitalism and imperialism. Imperialism is itself a phase of capitalist development in which Western European capitalist countries, the US and Japan, established political, economic, military and cultural hegemony over the other parts of the world, which were initially at a lower level and therefore could not resist domination. So the US and Japan I'll have to read more about, because Japan is also seen as a colonialist country. I think they invaded China at one point during World War I and World War II. So it's not just the European countries that were involved in that process. Imperialism was in effect the extended capitalist system which for many years embraced the whole world, one part being the exploiters and the others being the exploited. One being dominated and the other being the dominator. So, the politics of capitalism, which today you might say that this is now ultra-capitalism, where, for example, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, at least politically, workers in Western countries had a certain amount of rights through unions and so forth. But during the 1980s in particular, unions were broken down, or they decreased because of new policies that came in to promote policies for the capitalists or the wealthy. Anyway, let me read about this ultra-capitalism. This ultra-capitalism is an extreme form of capitalism where profit supersedes all other values, including social welfare, equality, and sustainability. It strips the economy down to its most competitive and unregulated state, maximizing corporate interests at the expense of workers, communities, and the environment. As I said, during the 80s, up to the 80s, you had workers' unions, which catered for social welfare of workers and equality and make sure they were treated right. But when the 1980s came in, you had prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher, they say in the US, Ronald Reagan, who went to break down the unions so corporations now could treat their workers worse. There was no structure there to ensure that workers were paid properly. Unlike traditional capitalism, which balances free markets with some public oversight, ultra-capitalism favors aggressive deregulation, weak labor protections, and unfettered corporate power. Ultra-capitalism also is a process of exploiting global South countries. For example, during the 70s to the 80s, when China began to expand, you'll find that Western countries that were supposed to be concerned with the workers of their own country began to export their production overseas to China, where it was cheaper. Hence, the working manufacturing sector within the US in particular and other Western countries began to decline to the extent that today when they want to bring those manufacturing structures back, they're finding it very difficult. And then they now have to contend with this so-called new technologies such as AI and robotics and automation, which may again affect the so-called working class, as they say, ordinary people. Ultra-capitalism evolved from neoliberal economic policies that emerged in the 1970s and accelerated after the Cold War. Its roots lie in the deregulation efforts made by leaders, as I said, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who dismantled labor protections, cut public services, and privatized industries. And the fall of the Soviet Union removed ideological competition, giving capitalism free rein to evolve without challenge. You know this thing called the capitalist concept of economies, where they see competition as one of the most important factors for a society to develop. In traditional society, it's not about competition, it's more about consensus. But this idea of competition has been pushed, or the concept of competition as a main factor for societal development has been promoted by the West, mainly for their own benefit and to change the structures of other societies. They don't seem to want to allow the idea of consensus as an economic structure as well as a political structure to develop, because the competitive structure seems to have benefited them, as we can see, with Western countries being the most economically strong, although China is coming up. But China has also adopted their structure to a certain extent. So the more cooperative worldview, which once existed, has been dominated by a new idea of competition between peoples. It seems the collective concept of the world, which would allow people to work together. Maybe you could argue that it's a more spiritual way of looking at the environment and the world and the people that you're living with, rather than seeing the world as a place where it's an hostile environment where you have to be competing with others in order to survive, which some would argue came out of the European mindset going back to the times of the Ice Age, where they were competing with each other for food. And there's a scarcity of food, a scarcity of resources in their own environment, which is one of the reasons also that they pushed out into the rest of the world after being educated by the Moors during the Moorish invasion from around 700 AD to around 1500 AD or 1400 AD, when they began to push the Arabs out of, or the Moors out of southern Europe, and they themselves began to expand into the Americas and to India and China and so forth, in their endeavors to look for resources. Anyway, we'll move on from this. So that's a look at the ultra-capitalism. The last section is some of the critiques or criticisms of capitalism coming from Walter Rodney in his book, Our Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in the process of developing its own country or its own region. So, the capitalist or bourgeois class is no longer capable of guiding the unlimited development of science and technology again, because these objectives now clash with the profit motive. Capitalism has proved incapable of transcending fundamental weaknesses such as underutilization of productive capacity, the persistence of a permanent sector of unemployment, and periodic economic crisis related to the concept of market, which is concerned with people's ability to pay rather than their need for commodities. So they're creating commodities and they want people to pay. Whether there's really a demand for the commodity is a different story. And yes, there are economic crashes ever so often under the capitalist system, where you have situations where you might call boom and bust, not in the same way that I mentioned earlier, where you have, for example, the housing crash of 2008, or the financial crisis of 2008, where products were sold improperly, I should say, to people under a credit system, this housing, this mortgage crisis. And then the whole thing crashed when they finally almost realized that people couldn't pay, and the system buckled basically, because you're selling products to somebody who can't afford to pay. You can only do that for a period of time before all those mortgage loans that you have been offered will be defaulted and your whole system will crash, which it did in 2008. Walter goes on to say, capitalism has created its own irrationalities, such as a vicious white racism, the tremendous waste associated with advertising, and the irrationality of incredible poverty in the midst of wealth and wastage even inside the biggest capitalist economies such as the US. Racism, I'm not sure if you can call capitalism causing racism. The racism was already there. In fact, racism was integrated into the system of capitalism in terms of how they took certain peoples and used them for exploitation. Slavery being an example. You think you can use a people because you see them as inferior, so you can use them as free labor or cheap labor. Wherever in the world, even today, currently, you have cheap labor being used. Yes, and there's poverty in the midst of wealth. It's greed again. The wealthy in society are not concerned with the large poor populations, whether they're working or not working. Even though those who are working for your corporation, you're not concerned about their welfare or how they're living. Their welfare is only concerned by you to the extent it affects their ability to work. So you pay them the minimum amount that you can, which allow them to work, come back to work the next day. Above all, capitalism has intensified its own political contradictions in trying to subjugate nations and continents outside of Europe, so that workers and peasants in every part of the globe have become self-conscious and are determined to take their destiny into their own hands. Such determination is also an integral part of the process of development. So these countries basically realize that in order for them to develop, they can't continue to be exploited by the Western countries. They see that the Western countries are exploiting them to make their own wealth and exploit their resources and their labor. So basically they realize that in order for them to become wealthy, they have to take things into their own hands and develop their own economies, producing their own things for their own country rather than producing goods for others to profit from. So that's a look at capitalism and the different stages of how capitalism developed and the different ideas around capitalism and critiques of capitalism. So that's it for now.